hate him. The sight of him makes me sick. And that he's still alive and breathing. And you still can just see the evil person coming out. If you look at this picture, you just see he's just evil and angry. I wish that I could tie him up and set him on fire. I wish that he could burn and suffer. I want him to feel the pain that he's inflicted. I wish he could be tortured the way he tortured me, and it's still torturing me. He's a monster, a faker, a lie. I wish I could. This was his ashes. Wesley Coonrod is my ex-husband. Wesley came at a dark point in my life and was like this hero. I think Wesley saw I was young and desperate. And, you know, girls, when they're desperate, they do whatever they can to provide for their children. He was someone I trusted, and he destroyed my life. Wesley didn't just destroy me. He destroyed my kids. He destroyed his family. This is a tragedy, and it lives in you forever. So I'll live with it for the rest of my life. Wesley was a knight in shining armor that turned into a monster. Before I met Wesley, I became a mom at 14. By the time I was 20, I already had 3 kids. But their father was on pills and stuff, so I was leaving him. I had nowhere to go. I had nobody to turn to. I was staying with a friend, and Wesley was her brother, and me and my kids had nowhere to go, so Wesley said, you could come live with me if you help take care of my son, and I'll take care of you guys financially, give you a place to live, and so we started staying there.
Okay, hold your horses, hey.
Wesley had a good sense of humor. He had pretty eyes. I mean, he's not the greatest looking man, but at that time, to be honest, he was 17 years older than me. And I just felt like he was someone that was going to take care of me, and I needed that. I was concerned about moving in with him, but my back was against the wall. So it was either go live with this man that I don't know or be homeless. Wesley seemed like he was going to be a good father figure for my children.
Hey guys, check this out.
I felt like my kids enjoyed hanging out with him when he was there. And then once we were living together, things just happened. I'd only been living in his house probably like 2 months when I got pregnant. So everything happened extremely fast. I thought I was in love, but he had me right where he wanted me. At one point, he told me that, well, I think we should get married. Will you marry me? I'm like, yeah. I was thinking about keeping a roof over my kids' head and having security, and everything else didn't matter. Wesley told me he loved me, but I don't even know if I know what love is at that point in my life, honestly. We got married on July 4th, 2005. It was a disaster. Everybody's out there trying to help get this together, and Wesley's, I don't know where Wesley was. I was mad, like, where is he? I kept looking at the driveway, you know, still wasn't pulling in. Couldn't figure out where he was. I think I tried to call him, I don't know how many times, probably 10, 20, but he wasn't answering, and I didn't know what to do. After a while, Wesley got there. He was belligerent drunk. Couldn't hardly walk. Couldn't hardly stand. So I'm so embarrassed. And that was, sign number one. Like, he's not even here to help set this thing up, but he wants to get married, I didn't think about, oh, this is a warning sign. Like, don't marry this guy. I was trying to have a good night. We was relaxing on the bed and then kissing and, he wanted to have sex. But Wesley wanted to have sex in other ways, and I didn't agree with it. So that's the first time he actually lashed out at me. There was a look that he had, like he just looked evil. I've never seen him like this. And he starts yelling at me, "You're my wife, you're supposed to do what I want." I was afraid of Wesley in that moment. I don't really remember what else he says because he was screaming and I was crying, and it was just a whole chaotic scene. Back then they had the little disposable cameras. I had been taking pictures all day, and the camera was on the table beside the bed, and he just grabbed it and threw it. He's destroying my memories of my wedding day. He destroyed it in 30 seconds. Wesley had never acted violent towards me until that night. Who knows? He done busted the camera. What is he gonna throw next? I regretted marrying Wesley at that point and cried myself to sleep thinking, what'd I do? I felt like that night I seen his true colors, like who he really was come out, and it was scary. I think Wesley definitely hid who he was and suppressed it until we were married, because I don't think he wanted me to know. After we got married is when everything started changing. Now he was who he truly was. Yelling, hollering, arguing. He liked to yell a lot. You see it in his eyes, the way he talks, his hand movements, like you just see it. Like it's a whole, like a split personality. I remember one day, I don't even remember what his son did, but him and Wesley's arguing. Wesley jerked his belt off and just started, swinging it wherever it landed. I got between them, pushed Wesley back, and he grabbed me and pushed me. Like, just get out of it, it's my kid. He's not gonna act like this. He's not your kid. Like, you can't tell me what to do with my son. I was afraid of Wesley in that moment because Wesley has like this switch that flips and like his eyes change, his whole demeanor changes, and it's kind of scary. When I seen this, I was like, man, he's never gonna whoop my kids. Like, they're not his kids, I'm not gonna have it. But in the back of my mind, I'm like, man, what am I gonna do if he does try to correct my kids like that? I seen him act out on my wedding night and then now this, but I had a dysfunctional family too, so I think it was just always easy just to ignore it. Wesley dropped me off at his sister's one day while he went to work. Wesley comes home from work to his sister's. I'm there, we're all outside. And he's screaming and yelling and cussing and calling me a whore. That kid ain't mine. And I'm like 5 or 6 months pregnant. He grabs my arm. I know it's about to get violent when he grabs me, and I just see it in his face. So I try to walk away from him, and of course my back's turned. I'm walking towards the house, but I hear the car start coming towards me, so I take off running. I trip over these rocks. He's like right behind me in the car. And his sister grabbed me as I'm falling and picked me up, and I'm crying. I'm terrified, and I'm pregnant with his child. He could have just killed us both. So she starts screaming for him to leave, and he left. We sat there for a little bit, and then we ended up just not talking about it no more. It's like it became normal not to talk about it. I believe if Wesley's sister wasn't there that day, he would have ran me over. It was terrifying, and you get that shame that comes over you and guilt because you're now in this relationship and you don't know how to get out and you don't know what to do. And everything that's going on is your fault because you chose this relationship. That's kind of how I felt. But I didn't know what to do. Wesley was excited when Thomas was born. Like, he didn't want to do nothing but hold him and spend time with him. And Wesley quit drinking, and I got that little bit of hope in me that, okay, well, things can change and we can have our family and I don't have to leave, you know? Because that's all I ever wanted. I just wanted to have a family. He stepped up a lot. He helped with dishes, he'd cook, he watched the kids while I showered. I thought maybe this kid is changing him. That was just my hopeful, wishful thinking. I was like 23 weeks pregnant or 24 weeks pregnant, and my water ruptured, and so I had to go to the hospital. When I was in the hospital room, he was calling, wanting me to leave. He couldn't deal with the kids, wanted me to leave the hospital. There wasn't nothing wrong with me. I didn't need to be there. I needed to be home with the kids, taking care of the house. And the baby's heart rate kept dropping because he was getting me so upset. It got to the point he was just calling so much, and we were arguing so much, and he was screaming. And the nurse at one point was like, I'm turning this phone off. And they quit putting his calls through. And I could have lost my child, but he didn't care about none of that. It was all about him. And then I finally got released 4 or 5 days. As soon as I get out of the car, I see Wesley standing in the door. I knew he was mad, and when I got inside, we instantly started arguing. He was just like, this is all your fault. You had this plot to get you out of here for a couple days. You left me here with these kids. So at this point, I'm standing in the living room. We're arguing. I walk towards the end of the couch where the kids are, and that's when Wesley picked the TV up and threw it at me. He missed my son by 1 inch. I honestly don't know that I felt or how I felt in that moment. I was kind of in shock. because at this point, I was terrified of Wesley. After Wesley threw the TV and it missed my son by a hair, I definitely knew he was capable of harming my kids too, in his fits of rage. Wesley had no consequences because I never called the cops, which I should have. I didn't want the cops to come because I was scared. I was scared of Wesley, and I was also scared that I would lose my kid to children's services. I was scared of what the outcome would be if I called the police, because you're just going to make things worse. The abuse is going to be worse. Looking back, if I would have left Wesley, here I am pregnant with another child. I have no money, no job, no car. You know, I've been dependent on him to take care of us. Yeah, I would be on the streets with the kids and a baby on the way. So I don't think leaving with him was a possibility, you know. I have no other choices but to stay. I feel like every day got worse. One day we were arguing about, I don't remember what. We got in each other's face. It was heated. He grabbed me by my hair, pulled me around the kitchen, and then at one point he ran my head into the stove, and I fell on the floor. All of the kids were crying, and I can't do nothing but lay there because I couldn't get up out of the floor.
Mom?
It was probably like 3 hours or so before I could get the feeling back in my legs, and I was able to get up. Wesley was still gone, so I just got up and took the kids and went in my room, and we laid down and went to sleep. I woke up the next morning, and I just remember thinking, like, he's gonna end up killing me if I don't get out of here. Wesley and his ex-wife was arguing on the phone, and I just heard something about him beating her. I don't think Wesley knew I could hear, but they argued a lot when they would get on the phone. So I waited until Wesley went to work, and then I decided to look up his criminal record just because I was curious what she was talking about. I didn't have a computer, so I used my cell phone. I remember standing there, we had this little window so you could see if anybody pulled up. And I was afraid maybe he forgot something or would come back, but once I started looking at it, I just sat in the chair, like, scrolling through it. I quit paying attention to if he was coming back because there was just so much. I found domestic violence and assault cases. I knew it would never stop with me. And I also knew, like, he was either gonna kill me or if I left, it would be the next person. After I looked up Wesley's record is when I tried to start to form a plan. I contacted legal aid and filled out an application, and they were gonna help me file for the divorce. I hadn't told him that I'd started the process for a divorce because I knew once he got served divorce papers, it would probably get real bad. Me and the kids were all outside. We had a swing set in the backyard. We had like a patio, so I was on the patio while they were playing. We had been out there for hours, and Wesley's drinking inside. And here he comes. He had this little pocket knife that he kept on his side, and he's just standing over me, not even saying anything. He's just dropping this knife, and it would stick in the deck. And he'd pull it back out, and he'd do it again. He was laughing, you know, like smiling the whole time he was doing it. And I just remember thinking, like, you're just so evil. This is the first time he ever used like a knife or anything to torture me with, or taunt me with. But my oldest son, he was yelling at him, like, you need to stop, leave my mom alone.
Hey, knock it off.
He said something like, you little bastard. And when he takes this full can of beer, wasn't even open, and wings it. It hit my son. I'm pretty sure it was right in the chest. And I just start crying, like, you just hit my kid, you know, like, I can't do this. It just, something clicked. I knew I needed to leave for a long time. I just didn't know how. So I tell the other ones to come on, and he's like, you're not taking my kids. But I knew I had to get out of there. So we walked 20 miles. I just knew I needed to get away from this man. I had to leave him. I was terrified, but it was worth getting my kids out of there. Like, no matter what I had to do, or I wanted my kids away from him. I was able to breathe. I was away from this man that abused me. I thought that was gonna be it. I'll get my divorce and we'll get this custody thing under control. And I was happy because I knew that they wasn't going through no more of this brainwashing and mental abuse and emotional abuse. And I was just excited that it was finally over. And then got the phone call. And at this point in my life, I didn't realize how bad of a turn that my life was about to take. It was just like another blow. You just shattered my world all over again. Oh, you know, my soul hurt. I felt so worthless, and I felt like I was nothing. I wish I could have stopped what was about to happen. This is Thomas, and this is Stephen. Thomas was 3. Stephen was probably 2 in this one. I just always want my kids to know how much I love them. And I'm sorry that I couldn't protect them from him. I think I did my best to protect them, the best that I could, the best that was in my ability. But I still felt like I failed. I don't think the feeling of failure or guilt will ever go away. Wesley told me all the time he wasn't signing for divorce. If he couldn't have me, nobody was gonna have me. We were back and forth in court fighting for my divorce. he wouldn't give it to me, but Wesley was made the residential custodial parent because he had the house. So Wesley got the boys. I had no choice but to leave Thomas and Stephen with Wesley because it was court ordered. Wesley didn't want the kids, but Wesley didn't want me to have the kids because that was his way of hurting me. Having to give him my kids after knowing all that we had been through and all that he was capable of is the worst feeling. Everything I had done was for nothing. I was on the phone on hold with the police department, and I was like, he's done something. He's done something to my kids. I just knew, in my gut, I just knew something bad happened and it was his fault. Probably like 30 seconds later, they told me that my kids died in a fire. I kept telling my mom it wasn't real and that we were going up there for Thomas's birthday. I had his cake with me. I just thought there was no way that my kids were gone. That's the apartment that my kids died in. The window on the right would have been their bedroom. The neighbor in the apartment next to Wesley went into his apartment and tried to get through the wall at one point. He's also the one that put his arm through the window and had to get stitches. But somewhere in all this, Wesley was standing in the front yard, which isn't very big, so he had to be right there. He had to hear his kids crying for help. It makes me nauseous. Wesley wouldn't tell anybody where the kids were in the house. These people were all just trying to get in. They hear my kids. They hear my kids crying. By the time the fire department got there, the fire was so hot that the floor was disappearing from under them. We got fire department, people begging him, like, please tell us where your kids are, you know, because everybody in the town knew there was kids in that house. Wesley was outside in the front yard asking for a cigarette. Why he hears his kids crying for help. I would never leave that house. I would have died in that fire trying to save my children. But he's in the front yard asking for a cigarette. If you're in a house fire, you're gonna have soot on you somewhere. Wesley didn't have none of that. There was no evidence of Wesley being in that house with that fire. None. Except for the burn on his hand. That was all there was. And the front door was locked as if you would lock it like you lock the bottom of the lock and you walk out and shut the door behind you. It was all locked down like that. The most damning evidence for me is that Wesley, he wasn't trying to save the kids. Smoke Thomas and Stephen's cause of death was smoke inhalation. They were feeling when they were taking their last breaths, you know? I see my two little boys in this room, terrified, with no way out of this house, and no one there to help them. And I'd see them probably holding on to each other, crying, you know? But probably thinking like, where's mommy or daddy, you know? I was glad he had been arrested, but I began to slowly lose my mind and unravel. I started using the day of the funeral. I started using nerve pills, and then it kind of just escalated from there. I became a drug addict. It's hard as a parent not to blame yourself. I pushed my other kids away. I didn't know how to be a mom anymore. I didn't know how to take care of my kids knowing that I lost them. Like, I just didn't know how to do it. So, Leslie was still destroying my life. I chose this man to be my husband. I chose to have kids with him. It's hard to get past that guilt of everything that's happened because that was my choice. They didn't ask to be in that house. They didn't ask for him to be their dad, you know? And yeah, that's a hard pill to swallow. It took me a long time to work on forgiving myself.
We tried the first trial October of 2010. The jurors openly sided with each other except for one person. She, after they started deliberating, said that she would not vote for anything that would cause him to get the death penalty. Jury finally came out with a verdict. They hung on all the counts except for endangering children. They found him guilty of 2 counts of that. And at that point, the other charges can be retried. Our approach at the first trial was to prove that the fire was an arson and to prove that Wesley had set the fire. We still intended to prove exactly that. So in the second trial, the defense's evidence changed hugely, though. They had focused on the boys being the fire setters somewhat in the first trial, but in the second trial, they really hammered on it. Ironically, the lighter that set the fire was childproof. So, which makes one wonder how those boys set the fire, but I don't believe that a 3-year-old and a 4-year-old did that. I believe he did that. As a parent, I cannot even imagine my kids going through something like that. I mean, what a terrible way. And they knew that something was wrong. I mean, they were screaming. The neighbors all testified you could hear those kids screaming out in the road. The defense asked for the lesser included offense of involuntary manslaughter, and the jury found him guilty of 2 counts of that. And basically that, says that he caused the death of another in the commission of another felony, and the felony that they relied upon was child endangering.
But the bottom line is it doesn't matter why the fire was started, how it was started. You as their parent had a duty to save them or to prevent it from happening. You are responsible. You failed in your duty to protect.
It pisses me off that he got involuntary manslaughter instead of arson and murder, because he's about to walk out of prison in 7 years and some odd months. In 20 years, the 20 years Wesley got sentenced to in prison, my kids would have just been starting to become men, you know, going to college and getting girlfriends and, you know, beginning to live their life. Your life is over. They didn't get to live theirs, you know? And it's not fair. You got 3 meals and a bed, a roof over your head, electric, water, and my kids are gone forever. I feel like he should die in prison. He should die in prison looking at the picture of my kids. You never think you should ever have to bury a child as a mother? It's hard. It's holidays, birthdays, songs, toys, places. It's all hard. I don't know how I get up every day and still go. Sometimes I don't want to get up. Sometimes I'm mad that I'm still waking up, you know, that I'm even still here. I guess it's by the grace of God, because I tried to kill myself with drugs and didn't work. So I'm here for a reason. I'm in the middle of getting my bachelor's degree in behavioral health with emphasis on substance abuse. I still clean, I go to counseling, so I'm still pushing to do more, to get further, to get my life back and make my kids proud and do the best I can.
The first sound that shattered the quiet morning was so ordinary that almost nobody reacted. A sharp crack echoed across a parking lot in Wheaton, Maryland, on October 2, 2002. For a heartbeat, shoppers continued walking toward the grocery store. Shopping carts rattled over faded white lines. A child laughed somewhere near the entrance. Engines idled as drivers searched for empty spaces beneath a pale autumn sky. Then a man collapsed onto the asphalt. At first, no one understood what they were seeing. There had been no argument. No scream. No struggle. No masked robber sprinting between parked cars. One moment James Martin was simply crossing the lot like thousands of Americans did every single day. The next, he was lying motionless on the cold pavement while strangers rushed toward him, desperately trying to understand why he had fallen. Some believed he had suffered a heart attack. Others looked around for a hit-and-run driver. Nobody thought to search the rooftops. Nobody searched the distant tree line. Nobody imagined that somewhere, hidden from every pair of frightened eyes, someone had calmly squeezed the trigger of a rifle. Within minutes, flashing emergency lights painted the parking lot in alternating shades of red and blue. Police officers secured the scene, paramedics fought to save a man they would soon realize they could not save, and investigators searched for clues that simply were not there. No shell casing. No witnesses. No obvious suspect. Only a single bullet that had arrived from nowhere. At that moment, it appeared to be an isolated murder, tragic but local. Detectives had no reason to believe they had just stepped into one of the most terrifying criminal investigations in modern American history. They could not know that this was only the beginning. Over the next 23 days, ordinary life would become something millions of people no longer trusted. Filling a gas tank would become an act of courage. Walking into a grocery store would feel like taking a gamble. Parents would glance toward school playgrounds with growing dread. Office workers would hesitate before stepping outside for lunch. Every open parking lot, every sidewalk, every suburban street would seem to offer an invisible line of fire. The killer did not demand attention through dramatic speeches or gruesome crime scenes. The killer demanded something far more powerful. Silence. One shot. Then another. Then another. Each attack lasted only a second. The fear lasted all day. People searched every direction except the correct one. They stared at rooftops, windows, passing vans, nearby buildings, and clusters of trees, trying to imagine where death might be hiding. The terrifying truth was that it could already be gone before anyone even realized a shot had been fired. Washington, D.C., Maryland, and Virginia had experienced tragedy before. Less than a year had passed since the September 11th attacks. The nation was still healing from wounds that remained painfully fresh. Americans had grown accustomed to hearing the words national security every evening on television. They worried about terrorism, suspicious packages, and threats from overseas. Few imagined that one of the greatest sources of fear would come from an ordinary American highway. There were no dramatic car chases. No hostage negotiations. No public declarations. Only an unseen rifleman who seemed capable of striking anyone, anywhere, at any time. As investigators struggled to understand the first killing, they unknowingly raced against a clock that had already started ticking. The next day, that clock would accelerate. Before sunrise on October 3rd, few people suspected that their routines were about to change forever. Landscapers loaded their equipment into pickup trucks. Postal workers prepared for another busy morning. Taxi drivers fueled their vehicles before beginning long shifts. Office employees grabbed coffee on the way to work. Children climbed onto school buses, laughing with friends, unaware that adults across the region would soon struggle to explain a fear they themselves could not understand. By sunset, 5 more people would be shot. The attacks appeared random. The victims had never met. Their ages were different. Their occupations were different. Their lives had followed completely different paths. Yet each one had unknowingly entered the same invisible crosshairs. News stations interrupted regular programming. Helicopters circled above neighborhoods. Reporters stood beside yellow police tape repeating the same questions investigators were asking behind closed doors. Who was responsible? Where was the shooter? How could someone disappear after every attack without leaving behind a meaningful trail? Every answer seemed to create 2 new questions. Fear spreads differently from violence. Violence leaves physical scars. Fear enters kitchens, classrooms, office buildings, and family cars. It follows parents into supermarkets. It sits beside commuters during traffic jams. It whispers into the minds of people performing ordinary tasks until nothing feels ordinary anymore. Within days, residents developed habits they had never imagined adopting. Some crouched beside their vehicles while pumping gasoline, hoping the metal body of the car might shield them from an unseen bullet. Others sprinted across parking lots with grocery bags swinging wildly in their hands. Children were told not to linger outside. Teachers shortened recess. Families cancelled weekend plans that only days earlier had seemed insignificant enough to postpone. Simple errands suddenly required courage. The shooter never announced where he would strike next. That uncertainty became his greatest weapon. Police departments worked around the clock. Patrol officers exhausted themselves chasing thousands of leads. Detectives interviewed witnesses who often remembered the same unsettling detail. They had heard a shot. Then they had heard screams. Nothing more. Some witnesses described a white box truck speeding away. Others recalled seeing a white van somewhere nearby. Those reports would dominate the investigation during its earliest days, sending law enforcement toward vehicles that ultimately had nothing to do with the killings. Meanwhile, the real killers continued watching. Watching the news. Watching investigators. Watching an entire region slowly surrender to anxiety. The attacks were not driven by impulse. They reflected preparation, patience, and an understanding that terror could become more powerful than the weapon itself. Every successful escape reinforced a chilling message. The shooter was always one step ahead. Or so it seemed. Behind the headlines existed another story, one far less visible than the crime scenes appearing across television screens. It was a story shaped over years rather than days. A story involving control, manipulation, resentment, and the gradual destruction of moral boundaries. One man had once worn the uniform of the United States Army, earning respect through discipline and service before personal failures, broken relationships, and obsessive anger transformed the direction of his life. The other was still a teenager. Separated by more than 2 decades in age, they would become linked through a relationship investigators, psychologists, and prosecutors would spend years trying to understand. It blurred the lines between mentorship and manipulation, loyalty and coercion, choice and control. By the time the first shot echoed across that Maryland parking lot, countless unseen decisions had already led to that moment. Those decisions would leave 10 people dead, 3 others wounded, and millions wondering whether simply stepping outside their front door might become the last ordinary thing they ever did. For 23 unforgettable days, the nation's capital would discover what it meant to fear an enemy without a face. And before investigators uncovered the truth, an entire region would learn that sometimes the most dangerous predator is not the one everyone can see. It is the one nobody realizes is already watching. No one wakes up expecting history to unfold outside the window. On the morning after the first shooting, the Washington metropolitan area looked exactly as it always had. The highways were already filling with commuters before sunrise. Coffee shops opened their doors to familiar faces. School buses followed the same routes they had traveled for years, stopping every few blocks to collect children carrying backpacks almost as large as themselves. Office lights flickered on one floor at a time as another ordinary workday quietly began. If fear existed, it was still confined to a single parking lot in Wheaton. The death of James Martin had made the evening news, but many viewers believed they had witnessed another isolated tragedy. Detectives were investigating. Reporters were asking questions. Families shook their heads for a moment before returning to dinner. In a country that witnessed thousands of murders each year, there seemed little reason to believe this particular case would grow into something that would soon dominate every television screen in America. But somewhere beyond the morning traffic, 2 people were already preparing for the next shot. They were not rushing. They were not panicking. They did not need to. Patience was part of the plan. Unlike crimes driven by rage or desperation, these attacks relied on calculation. Every movement was deliberate. Every location offered distance, concealment, and an escape route. The weapon itself was only one piece of a carefully constructed system designed to leave investigators staring at empty roads and silent parking lots long after the killers had disappeared. The blue Chevrolet Caprice attracted almost no attention. It blended effortlessly into the endless stream of family sedans moving across Maryland and Virginia. Its paint showed nothing remarkable. Its body carried no obvious damage. It looked like thousands of other aging American cars that quietly accumulated miles without attracting a second glance. Its greatest disguise was its normality. Hidden beneath that ordinary appearance, however, was something investigators would not discover until weeks later. The trunk had been transformed into a concealed firing position. A small opening had been cut behind the rear license plate, barely noticeable unless someone knew exactly where to look. Interior panels had been removed, allowing the shooter to crawl from the back seat into the trunk without stepping outside. Lying flat inside the darkness, the rifle could be positioned toward the tiny opening, turning the entire vehicle into a mobile sniper's nest. From the outside, there was no visible gun barrel. No open window. No movement. No clue that a rifle capable of striking a target hundreds of feet away was already aimed through an opening smaller than most people could cover with a hand. The design reflected patience rather than brilliance. It did not depend on sophisticated technology. It depended on something far more dangerous. It depended on people assuming they were safe. Late on October 3rd, the attacks began again. The first victim that day was working outdoors, focused entirely on the task in front of him. Landscapers often become invisible to passing drivers, blending into the background of suburban neighborhoods as they mow lawns, trim hedges, and prepare properties for another changing season. There was nothing unusual about the scene. Until a single bullet interrupted it. The shot echoed briefly before disappearing into silence. Within hours, another victim fell outside a post office. Then another. And another. By the end of the day, 5 separate shootings had occurred across the region. The pattern was impossible to ignore. This was no longer coincidence. Someone was hunting strangers. The realization spread faster than the investigators could organize their evidence. Television stations abandoned scheduled programming to provide continuous coverage. Helicopters hovered above fresh crime scenes. Maps filled with colored markers appeared beside news anchors attempting to explain locations that seemed connected only by distance and uncertainty. The public wanted answers. Law enforcement wanted answers even more. Instead, they found contradictions. Witnesses offered conflicting descriptions of suspicious vehicles. Some insisted they had seen a white van. Others reported a white box truck. A few remembered hearing tires squeal. Many heard nothing except the gunshot itself. Every new interview expanded the investigation while simultaneously pulling it in different directions. Thousands of officers throughout the region suddenly found themselves stopping white commercial vehicles, searching cargo areas, questioning drivers, and documenting license plates. Most of those people had absolutely nothing to do with the murders. Meanwhile, the actual killers continued moving unnoticed through the same highways crowded with police cruisers. The randomness of the attacks made them uniquely terrifying. Traditional homicide investigations usually begin with relationships. A spouse. A business partner. A family dispute. A financial motive. Someone who knew the victim. Here, investigators discovered almost nothing connecting one victim to another. Different neighborhoods. Different occupations. Different ages. Different backgrounds. The only common thread was that every victim happened to be outside when the trigger was pulled. That absence of logic became its own terrifying form of logic. If there was no pattern, then everyone fit the pattern. Parents suddenly noticed how exposed school parking lots really were. Gas stations felt strangely open, their wide concrete spaces offering little cover. Shopping centers, once associated with convenience and routine, now appeared vulnerable from every direction. Even waiting at a traffic light began to feel uncomfortable. People looked around not because they saw danger, but because they no longer trusted empty space. Psychologists would later describe this kind of fear as especially damaging because it destroys predictability. Human beings cope with risk when they understand it. A dangerous neighborhood can be avoided. A violent person can sometimes be recognized. A storm arrives with warning. But an unseen shooter selecting victims without any visible reason creates a different emotional response altogether. Every ordinary moment becomes suspicious. Every quiet parking lot becomes a possible crime scene waiting to happen. As investigators processed ballistic evidence from multiple shootings, another disturbing fact emerged. The bullets appeared remarkably consistent. Each microscopic marking left by the rifle barrel told a silent story. Although laboratories required time to confirm the details, specialists increasingly believed the same firearm had been used again and again. The murders were connected. The region was facing a serial offender unlike any it had experienced before. Inside command centers, maps grew more crowded by the hour. Colored pins marked each shooting. Road networks were studied. Travel times were calculated. Behavioral analysts debated whether the attacks reflected military training or simple luck. Some argued the shooter possessed advanced marksmanship skills. Others believed careful planning mattered more than exceptional accuracy. No theory completely explained what investigators were seeing. Outside those briefing rooms, the emotional cost continued rising. Families postponed birthday parties. Outdoor sporting events drew smaller crowds. Children noticed adults whispering while the evening news played in the background. Businesses dependent on outdoor customers reported fewer visitors. The fear was no longer confined to those directly touched by violence. It had become communal, invisible, persistent. Unknown to nearly everyone watching the headlines, the man directing this campaign of terror had once sworn an oath to protect his country. John Allen Muhammad had served in the United States Army, where discipline, structure, and firearms training became part of daily life. Former colleagues remembered a capable soldier. Few could have imagined that years later those same skills would be redirected toward innocent civilians. Military service alone did not create a murderer. Millions of veterans returned to ordinary lives without harming anyone. The explanation lay elsewhere, buried beneath years of personal failures, broken relationships, financial instability, and an increasingly obsessive need to dominate the people around him. Control became the center of his world. Those who challenged that control often became enemies in his mind. By the time investigators began searching for a serial sniper, that mindset had already expanded into something far darker than revenge. Standing beside him was a teenager whose life had followed an entirely different path. Lee Boyd Malvo had grown up searching for belonging. The absence of stability made him vulnerable to someone willing to offer certainty, purpose, and approval. What began as guidance gradually became dependence. What resembled mentorship slowly transformed into manipulation. Investigators would later spend years examining how completely one personality had come to shape another. But in early October 2002, none of that history was visible. Police officers did not know the names. The public had never seen the faces. They were chasing shadows cast by a rifle hidden inside an ordinary sedan. With every passing day, the distance between law enforcement and the killers seemed to widen. Yet hidden among thousands of reports, witness interviews, ballistic examinations, and anonymous phone calls, small fragments of truth were already beginning to surface. No one recognized their significance. Not yet. The region still believed it was witnessing the beginning of an investigation. In reality, the countdown toward one of the largest manhunts in modern American history had already begun. October arrives quietly in the Washington metropolitan area. The suffocating heat of summer finally loosens its grip, replaced by crisp mornings and cool afternoons that invite people back outside. The trees lining suburban streets begin their slow transformation, their green leaves fading into shades of amber, crimson, and gold. Neighborhoods that only weeks earlier echoed with lawn mowers and children's laughter now settle into a gentler rhythm. Coffee tastes warmer. Evening walks grow longer. Families prepare for Halloween decorations, football weekends, and the approach of another holiday season. For millions of people living across Washington, D.C., Maryland, and Northern Virginia, October has always carried a comforting sense of routine. It is a region unlike any other in the United States. The nation's capital stands at its center, surrounded by an endless network of suburbs stretching across state lines. Every morning, hundreds of thousands of commuters pour onto highways leading toward government offices, military bases, technology companies, hospitals, schools, and businesses. Some cross from Virginia into Washington before sunrise. Others leave quiet Maryland neighborhoods, stopping for coffee before joining the steady river of traffic flowing toward another ordinary workday. Life here moves with remarkable predictability. The same train arrives every morning. The same gas station serves the same commuters. The same grocery stores welcome familiar customers. Neighbors wave as they collect newspapers from their driveways. Parents walk children toward school buses. Retirees stroll through local parks before breakfast. Landscapers trim lawns outside office buildings while delivery drivers unload trucks behind shopping centers. Most people never imagine that such ordinary places could become crime scenes. Parking lots exist to park cars. Gas stations exist to refill fuel tanks. Sidewalks exist to connect one destination to another. They are transitional spaces, crossed almost without thought. That assumption, that ordinary places are safe simply because they are ordinary, would soon disappear. In early October 2002, America was still living beneath the shadow of September 11th. Just over 1 year had passed since hijacked airplanes changed the country forever. Flags still hung from front porches and office buildings. Photographs of missing loved ones had been replaced by memorials, but grief had not faded. Security barriers surrounded federal buildings. National Guard soldiers could still be seen at airports. Television news continued discussing terrorism, homeland security, biological threats, and the possibility of another attack. The nation's attention remained focused outward. Danger, many believed, would arrive from organized terrorist groups operating overseas. Few imagined that fear would instead emerge from within familiar American suburbs. Unlike New York or Los Angeles, the Washington metropolitan area is a patchwork of communities connected by highways rather than city streets alone. One neighborhood blends into another almost seamlessly. A driver can leave Virginia, enter Washington, and continue into Maryland without ever feeling that the landscape has dramatically changed. Shopping centers look remarkably similar. Residential developments repeat familiar architectural patterns. Gas stations appear every few miles. To an outsider, the region can seem enormous. To someone who knows its roads, however, it offers countless opportunities to move unnoticed. Major highways such as Interstate 95, Interstate 495, Interstate 270, and Route 50 create an intricate web linking hundreds of neighborhoods together. During rush hour, traffic often slows to a crawl, surrounding every vehicle with hundreds of others that look nearly identical. A blue sedan. A white pickup. A family minivan. A delivery truck. Nothing stands out for very long. For investigators, this geography would become one of the greatest challenges they had ever faced. A shooter could strike in one jurisdiction, merge into traffic within seconds, and cross into another county before the first emergency call even reached dispatchers. Each county maintained its own police department. Each city had its own investigators. Each state operated under different legal procedures. Although cooperation existed, no one anticipated just how essential that cooperation would soon become. Long before detectives realized they were hunting serial killers, the killers themselves had already studied movement. They understood roads. They understood timing. Most importantly, they understood human routine. Morning commuters followed predictable schedules. Gas stations became busiest before work. Shopping centers filled during lunch hours. Parents picked up children at nearly identical times every afternoon. The rhythm of suburban life created patterns invisible to those living inside them. Patterns that could be observed. Patterns that could be exploited. Across Maryland, communities like Wheaton, Bowie, Aspen Hill, and Silver Spring represented the image of middle-class suburban America. Families maintained carefully trimmed front lawns. Children rode bicycles beneath rows of maple trees. Weekend soccer games filled public parks with folding chairs, whistles, and cheering parents. People knew the names of neighborhood grocery clerks. Local coffee shops recognized regular customers before they reached the counter. Safety was rarely discussed because it was quietly assumed. Violent crime certainly existed, as it does in every metropolitan region, but random public executions carried out by unseen snipers belonged more to distant war zones than American suburbia. Northern Virginia presented a similar picture. Busy commercial districts blended into peaceful residential neighborhoods. Military personnel lived beside teachers, engineers, accountants, and government employees. Shopping malls attracted families every weekend. Large office parks surrounded by decorative landscaping reflected the region's economic growth during the late 1990s. No one entering those parking lots looked toward distant tree lines before stepping out of their cars. There seemed no reason to. Washington itself stood only a short drive away. The White House. The Capitol. The Pentagon. Some of the most heavily protected buildings in the world occupied the same metropolitan area that would soon struggle to stop two men hiding inside an aging Chevrolet sedan. The contrast could hardly have been greater. Billions of dollars had been invested protecting national institutions. Yet no amount of security could protect someone pumping gasoline in a suburban station. No checkpoint could guard every parking lot. No surveillance camera watched every stretch of highway. The killers understood this imbalance. Their targets were never symbols of political power. They were ordinary citizens. People whose names had never appeared in newspapers before tragedy suddenly introduced them to the nation. The randomness served a psychological purpose. If a government official had been assassinated, investigators could immediately examine political motives. If a wealthy business executive had been killed, detectives would explore financial disputes. But what motive connects a landscaper and a schoolchild? A taxi driver and an FBI employee? A retiree reading a book and someone buying groceries? There appeared to be none. That absence of connection magnified public fear. Everyone saw themselves reflected in at least one victim. The attacks were not confined to dangerous neighborhoods. Many occurred in places people visited every week. Every trip to the grocery store suddenly carried a question no one had considered before. What if today is the day? Television quickly became the emotional center of the crisis. Every evening, families gathered around living room screens searching for reassurance. Instead, they watched maps covered with red circles marking fresh shootings. News anchors repeated the same locations over and over until unfamiliar suburban intersections became recognizable across the country. Helicopter footage showed yellow police tape surrounding gas stations. Reporters interviewed shaken witnesses standing beside abandoned shopping carts. Experts debated ballistics, behavioral profiles, and possible motives. The repetition itself deepened the anxiety. The attacks were no longer isolated events. They had become a daily expectation. Children overheard conversations adults believed were private. Teachers answered frightened questions they themselves could not answer. Businesses quietly adjusted routines. Employees were encouraged to park closer to entrances. Some schools altered outdoor activities. People who had never met one another suddenly shared a common experience. Looking over their shoulders. Every open space seemed larger than before. Every unfamiliar parked car attracted attention. Every unexpected sound interrupted conversations. Autumn still painted the trees brilliant shades of red and orange. The weather remained beautiful. Yet beneath that beauty, an invisible tension slowly settled across the region. People continued living because life demanded it. Bills still had to be paid. Children still attended school. Doctors still treated patients. Mail still arrived every morning. But something fundamental had changed. Routine no longer brought comfort. Routine had become predictable. And predictability, as the coming days would reveal, could be deadly. Unbeknownst to millions of residents beginning another ordinary October, two individuals were already moving quietly through this familiar landscape, observing the same roads, the same parking lots, and the same daily habits that everyone else took for granted. For them, the Washington metropolitan area was not simply home. It was a hunting ground waiting to be exploited. Long before the first shot echoed across a Maryland parking lot, the story had already begun. Not with a rifle. Not with a blue Chevrolet Caprice. Not even with a plan to terrorize an entire metropolitan region. Like many true crime cases that leave investigators searching for a single defining moment, this one refuses to offer a simple beginning. There was no afternoon when an ordinary man suddenly became a monster. No single decision transformed a teenage boy into an accomplice. Instead, the path unfolded slowly, built from years of resentment, fractured relationships, emotional manipulation, and an obsession with control that grew stronger every time life refused to bend to one man's will. To understand why strangers would eventually become targets, it is necessary to step away from the crime scenes and look at the people standing behind the rifle. John Allen Muhammad entered the world in 1960 as John Allen Williams. His childhood was marked by instability from an early age. His mother died when he was still a young boy, leaving him to be raised by relatives under circumstances that never provided the emotional foundation many children rely upon. People who later studied his life often pointed to those early years not as an excuse for his future crimes, but as part of a much larger psychological puzzle. Children learn trust before they learn responsibility. When trust is repeatedly broken, some spend adulthood searching desperately for certainty. Others attempt to create certainty by controlling everyone around them. As Muhammad grew older, he appeared capable of presenting two completely different versions of himself. One version impressed people. He was disciplined, organized, physically fit. He joined the United States Army, where structure replaced chaos and clear rules governed daily life. Military service offered something his earlier years often lacked: purpose. Fellow service members described him as intelligent and capable. He served during the Gulf War, receiving firearms training and learning skills that demanded patience, concentration, and precision. There was nothing inevitable about what came later. Millions of soldiers leave military service carrying the same training without ever harming another innocent person. The rifle would never become the explanation. The man holding it would. After leaving the military, Muhammad struggled to build a stable civilian life. Employment became inconsistent. Financial problems accumulated. Relationships deteriorated. Perhaps most significant of all was the collapse of his marriage. Divorce can leave emotional scars in even the healthiest relationships. In Muhammad's case, investigators and prosecutors later argued that those scars evolved into something much darker. Court records, testimony, and interviews painted the picture of a man who viewed separation not as the end of a relationship but as a personal humiliation. Control had slipped away. He could not accept that. Friends and family members later described behavior that became increasingly possessive and intimidating. Arguments intensified. Allegations of domestic abuse emerged. Legal disputes over custody deepened his resentment. Every courtroom hearing represented another reminder that judges, not he, would determine the future of his children. To someone obsessed with absolute control, that reality became intolerable. Over time, anger hardened into fixation. Rather than adapting to life after divorce, Muhammad appeared to construct an alternative reality in which responsibility always belonged to someone else. Employers failed him. The legal system failed him. Society failed him. Most of all, he believed his former wife had betrayed him. That belief would eventually become one of the central themes investigators identified while reconstructing his motives. Prosecutors later argued that the sniper attacks themselves were never the ultimate objective. According to their theory, Muhammad intended to create weeks of random killings so terrifying that when he finally murdered his ex-wife, Police would mistake her death for another anonymous sniper victim. Whether every detail of that alleged long-term plan can ever be known with certainty remains debated among researchers, but the evidence presented during the investigation revealed an extraordinary level of planning surrounding his actions. The murders were not spontaneous. They unfolded according to preparation. Preparation required another person. That person was Lee Boyd Malvo. Thousands of miles away from Mohammed's early life, Malvo's childhood followed an entirely different path. Born in Jamaica in 1985, he experienced instability of another kind. His parents separated when he was young. Financial hardship shaped much of his early life. Constant movement between countries and changing circumstances left little opportunity to establish lasting friendships or dependable routines. Children naturally search for belonging. When that belonging is absent, they often become vulnerable to those willing to provide it. By the time Malvo met Mohammed, he was still trying to discover who he wanted to become. Mohammed seemed to have an answer. Witnesses who encountered the pair before the shootings often described them as father and son. The age difference supported that assumption, and Mohammed rarely discouraged it. To outsiders, they appeared unusually close. They traveled together, ate together, spent nearly every day together. What outsiders could not easily observe was the imbalance inside that relationship. Mohammed possessed experience, authority, and confidence. Malvo possessed youth, uncertainty, and a profound desire for acceptance. Psychologists who later evaluated the teenager described a gradual process of manipulation rather than sudden indoctrination. Control rarely begins with commands. It begins with trust. One conversation. One lesson. One shared hardship. One compliment. One promise that someone finally understands you. Bit by bit, independent judgment weakens. The manipulator becomes mentor. The mentor becomes protector. Eventually, the protector becomes the only voice that matters. Investigators later concluded that Mohammed exercised extraordinary psychological influence over Malvo, shaping not only his daily routine but also his perception of morality, loyalty, and identity. The teenager's world grew smaller. Within that shrinking world, Mohammed became its unquestioned center. As months passed, the two traveled extensively across the United States, often living transient lifestyles, sleeping in inexpensive motels, homeless shelters, abandoned buildings, or inside vehicles. They rarely remained in one place for long. Constant movement served practical purposes, but it also reinforced dependence. Malvo had few relationships beyond Mohammed. Isolation strengthened control. Some acquaintances remembered the teenager as polite and soft-spoken. Others recalled that he seemed unusually quiet, frequently allowing Mohammed to answer questions on his behalf. Nothing about those brief encounters suggested that the pair would soon become the focus of one of the largest manhunts in American history. Yet beneath the surface, preparations quietly continued. Investigators later discovered evidence that Mohammed practiced marksmanship with remarkable discipline. The Bushmaster XM-15 rifle was not treated as an ordinary firearm. It became an instrument requiring consistency, precision, routine. Equally significant was the modification of the Chevrolet Caprice. The vehicle itself reflected careful experimentation. Every alteration served a specific purpose. The hidden firing port concealed the rifle. The interior modifications allowed the shooter to remain invisible. The trunk became a protected firing position from which a single shot could be delivered before the vehicle calmly rejoined traffic. Nothing about the design suggested panic. Everything suggested patience. That patience would become one of the investigation's greatest obstacles. Unlike many serial offenders driven by uncontrollable impulses, Mohammed appeared willing to wait. Hours. Sometimes longer. He understood that the most effective attack was not necessarily the quickest one. It was the one least expected. Meanwhile, the people who would eventually become victims continued living ordinary lives completely unaware that they had entered someone else's calculations. A landscaper scheduled another morning shift. A retired man planned a shopping trip. Parents prepared school lunches. An FBI analyst left home expecting another routine day at work. A teenage boy looked forward to seeing classmates. Their lives shared no connection. They belonged to different communities, different professions, different generations. None of them knew each other. None of them knew Mohammed. None of them knew Malvo. Yet they were all about to become connected by a story that would force an entire nation to question the safety of everyday life. When investigators later assembled timelines, maps, receipts, fingerprints, ballistic evidence, and witness statements, they realized the attacks had never been acts of random chaos committed by impulsive offenders. Behind every shooting stood preparation. Behind every preparation stood manipulation. And behind that manipulation stood a man whose desire for absolute control had grown so overwhelming that innocent strangers became nothing more than pieces on a board he believed he alone had the right to move. The stage had now been set. The hunters had chosen their weapon. They had prepared their vehicle. They had studied the roads. All that remained was the moment when planning would finally give way to violence, and an ordinary autumn morning would become the beginning of a nightmare that no one in Washington, Maryland, or Virginia would ever forget. Before the names of the killers became known across America, there were other names that mattered more. The victims. In stories about notorious crimes, the attention often shifts toward the person who caused the suffering. The investigation, the manhunt, the courtroom battles, and the psychology of the offender can dominate headlines for years. But behind every headline, every police report, and every television broadcast, there were human beings whose lives existed long before they became part of a criminal case. They were not symbols. They were not numbers. They were fathers, mothers, husbands, wives, friends, co-workers, neighbors, and strangers who happened to be standing in the wrong place at the wrong moment. They had routines. They had plans. They had ordinary hopes that seemed guaranteed to continue into the future. On October 2, 2002, James Martin was not thinking about danger. He was not expecting his name to appear on national television. He was simply living another normal day. That morning began like thousands of other mornings across Maryland. People prepared for work. Cars moved through familiar streets. Stores opened their doors. Employees arranged products on shelves. Customers entered and exited without imagining that violence could suddenly appear in the middle of such a routine environment. James Martin was 55 years old. To the outside world, he was not a famous person. He was not someone whose name appeared in newspapers before tragedy placed him there. Like most people, he was known most deeply by those closest to him. His family knew the small details that never appeared in official statements. The way he spoke. The way he laughed. The habits that made him familiar. The simple moments that create the foundation of a person's life. Those are the things a criminal case cannot fully capture. A police report can record the location, the time, the evidence. But it cannot record the empty chair at a family table. It cannot record the silence that follows when someone realizes a familiar voice will never answer again. On that morning in Wheaton, James Martin entered a grocery store parking lot. The place was ordinary. That was the most terrifying part. There was no warning. No confrontation. No connection between him and the person watching from a distance. He was not selected because of something he had done. He was not targeted because of a personal conflict. He was simply there. A stranger's life was taken by someone who had never met him. The bullet that ended his life also began a chain of events that would change the emotional landscape of an entire region. At first, investigators did not know they were looking at the beginning of a pattern. They saw one victim, one crime scene, one unanswered question. Who would want James Martin dead? The search for motive is one of the first instincts in homicide investigations. Detectives look for relationships, arguments, financial disputes, personal conflicts, someone with a reason. But in James Martin's case, the answer was hidden in plain sight. There was no reason. And that absence of reason would become the most frightening clue of all. Because if there was no connection between victim and attacker, then almost anyone could become the next victim. The second attack transformed uncertainty into fear. The third attack transformed fear into panic. Soon, the names of multiple victims would appear together in a single investigation, connected not by their lives but by the moment their lives were interrupted. Each victim represented a different story. Different dreams. Different responsibilities. Different futures that disappeared instantly. One of those victims was a man whose daily work placed him outdoors. For years, he had maintained properties, cutting grass and caring for landscapes that most people passed without noticing. It was physical work, demanding patience and consistency. The type of job where a person begins early, spends hours under the open sky, and takes pride in seeing a neglected space become something beautiful. On October 3rd, he was doing exactly what he had done countless times before. Working. Focused on a normal task. Surrounded by the sounds of suburban life. The hum of equipment. The movement of passing vehicles. The distant voices of neighbors. Then came the sound that would become associated with terror throughout the region. A single gunshot. The attack did not come with an argument. It did not come with a warning. The victim had no chance to understand why. In the seconds before violence arrived, he was simply a person completing another day of work. That detail would repeat throughout the case. The victims were not preparing for danger because there was no reason for them to believe danger existed. They were not entering a battlefield. They were entering parking lots, workplaces, gas stations, places designed around ordinary human activity. Another victim was attacked while visiting a post office. A post office is one of the most familiar places in American communities. People go there to send letters, collect packages, handle paperwork, or complete small tasks that rarely feel significant. Most visits last only a few minutes. A person enters, completes a simple errand, returns to life. But for one individual in October 2002, that routine ended permanently. The tragedy of these attacks was not only the loss of life. It was the destruction of trust. The victims had done nothing unusual. They had not taken dangerous risks. They had not placed themselves in threatening situations. They were participating in everyday life. And everyday life was exactly what the attackers exploited. As the list of victims grew, communities struggled to understand how such different people could become connected. The victims were not members of the same family. They did not work together. They did not share enemies. They came from different backgrounds, different neighborhoods, different generations. Their only connection was the weapon that found them. For their families, however, they were never just names connected to a famous investigation. They remained individuals. A loved one who had a favorite meal. A person who had a particular way of telling stories. Someone whose absence changed every future holiday, every birthday, every family gathering. The public saw a growing crime pattern. Families experienced something much more personal. They experienced the sudden collapse of a future they had assumed was guaranteed. There is a particular cruelty in random violence. When someone loses a loved one because of a known enemy, there is often at least an explanation, however painful. There is a person to blame, a conflict to understand, a reason to process. But random violence creates a different wound. It leaves families asking questions that may never have answers. Why them? Why that day? Why that location? What if they had left 5 minutes later? What if they had taken another route? What if a simple decision had been different? Those questions can remain for decades. As investigators continued searching for the person responsible, the victims' stories risked becoming buried beneath the scale of the manhunt. Hundreds of officers. Thousands of tips. National media coverage. The search for two unknown attackers became one of the largest criminal investigations in American history. But every development in the case represented a life that had already been lost. Every new press conference was built upon someone else's tragedy. The victims were the reason the investigation existed. They were the reason the country demanded answers. And they were the reminder that behind every crime scene photograph was a place where someone had once stood, someone who had expected to continue living long after that moment. The killers wanted people to remember fear. They wanted the public to focus on uncertainty. They wanted attention. But the most important story was never about the men hiding inside the blue Chevrolet Caprice. It was about the people who never knew they were being watched. The people who left home that morning believing they would return. The people whose ordinary days became the final chapters of their lives. And as the attacks continued across the region, more families would join a group they never wanted to belong to. Families forced to learn that the most frightening words in a criminal investigation are not always the identity of the suspect. Sometimes, they are the realization that the victim could have been anyone. As the days passed, newspapers filled with maps, timelines, and breaking developments. Television broadcasts displayed photographs of crime scenes, police cruisers, and investigators standing behind yellow tape. The public searched for clues that might explain who was responsible and why these attacks were happening. Yet behind every headline was a family whose life had changed forever. For them, this was never simply the Beltway sniper case. It was the sudden absence of someone they loved. Each victim left behind people who had expected to see them again that evening. A spouse waiting for dinner. Children expecting a parent to return home. Friends planning to meet later in the week. Co-workers whose conversations would never be finished. The attacks drew national attention because they appeared random, but the losses themselves were deeply personal. One family no longer heard familiar footsteps entering the house after work. Another faced the painful task of explaining to children why someone they loved would never come home again. Simple routines suddenly carried overwhelming reminders. An empty chair at the dinner table. A jacket still hanging by the front door. A voicemail that would never be deleted because it contained the last recording of a familiar voice. These quiet moments rarely appeared in news reports, but they became the reality that families carried long after television cameras had moved on. The uncertainty surrounding the investigation made that grief even more difficult. When a homicide has a known suspect, families often begin searching for answers almost immediately. In October 2002, investigators themselves did not yet know who they were looking for. Every new attack meant another family entered the same painful uncertainty while detectives raced to prevent the next shooting. Communities responded in remarkable ways. Neighbors checked on one another more often. Schools reassured parents as best they could while adjusting outdoor activities and emergency procedures. Religious congregations opened their doors for prayer services and counseling. Local businesses adapted their routines to help employees feel safer, even though no one could promise that any precaution would be enough. Fear became a shared experience, but so did compassion. People who had never met offered support to grieving families. Volunteers organized meals and practical assistance. Counselors worked with children struggling to understand why ordinary places suddenly felt frightening. The attacks demonstrated how quickly violence can affect an entire community, not only those directly injured. Law enforcement officers also faced extraordinary pressure. Police departments across Washington, Maryland, and Virginia worked together on a scale rarely seen before in the region. Investigators from local agencies, state police, and federal authorities shared information, compared evidence, and followed thousands of leads. Most tips proved unrelated. Many witnesses genuinely wanted to help but remembered different details. Sorting useful information from mistaken observations became one of the investigation's greatest challenges. Meanwhile, officers continued responding to each new crime scene knowing another attack could occur before they had finished processing the previous one. For first responders, the emotional burden was significant. Paramedics arrived hoping they could save lives. Police officers secured scenes while comforting witnesses who had just experienced unimaginable events. Crime scene investigators documented evidence with painstaking care, understanding that even the smallest detail might eventually identify the people responsible. Every decision mattered. The public, however, saw only fragments of that work. They watched press conferences, read newspaper articles, and waited for updates, often unaware of the thousands of hours being invested behind the scenes. As the investigation expanded, behavioral experts and forensic specialists joined detectives in trying to understand the pattern of the attacks. Ballistics analysis became particularly important. By comparing microscopic markings left on recovered bullets, forensic examiners determined that multiple shootings were linked to the same firearm. This scientific evidence helped investigators confirm that they were confronting a connected series of attacks rather than unrelated crimes. That realization was both helpful and deeply concerning. It focused the investigation, but it also confirmed that the same offender remained at large. Throughout the region, daily life continued because it had to. Hospitals treated patients. Schools remained open. Businesses served customers. People still needed groceries, gasoline, and medicine. Yet almost every ordinary activity carried a new awareness of vulnerability. Parents watched children more closely in parking lots. Customers hurried between stores and their vehicles. People found themselves looking around before stepping into open spaces, not because they expected danger at every moment, but because uncertainty had become part of everyday life. For many residents, that psychological impact lasted long after the investigation ended. The events of October 2002 became a reminder that public safety depends not only on preventing crime but also on restoring confidence once fear has spread through a community. The eventual identification and arrest of those responsible would bring important answers, but it could never erase the losses experienced by the victims' families. Their lives had already been permanently changed. Today, the case continues to be studied by investigators, criminologists, and emergency management professionals. It influenced how law enforcement agencies coordinate across jurisdictions, how forensic evidence is shared, and how public communication is managed during rapidly evolving investigations. Those institutional lessons remain valuable. But perhaps the most enduring lesson is a human one. On the morning of October 3, 2002, investigators were still treating the death of James Martin as an isolated homicide. Detectives interviewed witnesses, documented the scene, and searched for any indication that the victim had been targeted because of a personal dispute, robbery, or another identifiable motive. At that stage, there was little evidence suggesting the shooting was connected to anything larger. Within hours, that assumption changed. As reports of additional shootings arrived from different locations across the Washington metropolitan area, law enforcement agencies began comparing details from each scene. Although the victims had no apparent relationship to one another, investigators noticed important similarities. Each shooting involved a single, carefully aimed rifle round. There was no confrontation between victim and offender, no attempt to steal property, and no eyewitness who could confidently identify the shooter. The locations were also strikingly ordinary. Public parking lots, commercial areas, and roadside businesses became scenes of major investigations. These were places thousands of people used every day without giving personal safety much thought. The growing number of incidents quickly transformed what initially appeared to be a local homicide investigation into a regional emergency. Police departments across Maryland, Virginia, and the District of Columbia began sharing information at an unprecedented pace. Local investigators coordinated with state police, the FBI, and the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms and Explosives. Command centers were established to organize evidence, compare witness statements, and prioritize incoming tips. One of the earliest challenges involved witness reports. In the immediate aftermath of stressful events, people often remember different details or interpret what they saw differently. Some witnesses reported seeing a white commercial van or box truck near one or more scenes. Because several independent accounts mentioned similar vehicles, investigators devoted substantial resources to locating and stopping white vans throughout the region. Although those reports were made in good faith, they ultimately did not identify the offenders. The volume of information demonstrated both the value and the difficulty of relying on eyewitness testimony during rapidly developing investigations. At the same time, forensic specialists examined physical evidence recovered from the scenes. Ballistics experts compared bullets and fragments recovered during the investigation. Firearms identification relies on microscopic markings created as a bullet travels through a barrel. Those markings can help determine whether bullets were fired from the same weapon. As more evidence became available, examiners concluded that multiple shootings were linked to a single rifle. This finding fundamentally changed the investigation. Rather than pursuing several unrelated offenders, authorities now understood they were searching for one coordinated series of attacks. That conclusion shaped every subsequent decision, from the allocation of investigative resources to the way information was shared among agencies. Meanwhile, residents across the region were adjusting their daily routines. Schools reviewed emergency procedures and modified outdoor activities where appropriate. Some businesses advised employees to remain alert in open parking areas. Community leaders worked to provide accurate information while discouraging rumors that could increase public anxiety. News organizations provided continuous coverage, often broadcasting updates throughout the day. As maps of confirmed incidents expanded, residents became increasingly aware that the affected locations crossed multiple jurisdictions rather than remaining confined to one neighborhood. Investigators also faced the practical challenge of coordinating thousands of leads. Telephone tip lines received an extraordinary volume of calls. Officers evaluated reports of suspicious vehicles, unusual behavior, and possible sightings. Most information proved unrelated to the case, but each report required careful assessment because any one of them might contain a critical piece of evidence. The workload placed considerable pressure on investigators, dispatchers, forensic personnel, and patrol officers alike. Even as detectives processed evidence from existing crime scenes, they had to prepare for the possibility that another incident could occur elsewhere in the region. This required careful coordination between investigative teams and uniformed officers responsible for responding to emergencies and reassuring the public. By the end of the first days of the investigation, one fact had become unmistakably clear. The Washington metropolitan area was not confronting a series of ordinary homicides. Authorities were facing an offender, or offenders, who appeared willing to strike without warning, across jurisdictional boundaries, and against people with no apparent connection to one another. Finding those responsible would require extensive cooperation, careful forensic analysis, and disciplined investigative work. The coming weeks would test every one of those capabilities. As additional shootings occurred during October 2002, the investigation expanded rapidly in both scale and complexity. Law enforcement agencies from Washington, D.C., Maryland, and Virginia recognized that no single jurisdiction could effectively manage the case alone. More than 20 agencies ultimately participated in the investigation, supported by federal resources including the FBI. A central objective became identifying reliable patterns. Investigators examined the timing of each shooting, the geographic distribution of incidents, the locations selected, and any available forensic evidence. Although the victims differed widely in age, occupation, and background, the attacks shared important characteristics. They occurred in public locations, involved a single rifle shot, and allowed the offender or offenders to leave the area before witnesses could identify them. Forensic science became one of the investigation's most valuable tools. Firearms examiners compared bullets recovered from multiple crime scenes using comparison microscopes. The microscopic marks left on bullets during firing allowed specialists to determine that several of the attacks had been carried out with the same rifle. This conclusion confirmed that investigators were dealing with a connected series of crimes rather than unrelated homicides. At the same time, crime analysts began constructing increasingly detailed timelines. They compared emergency call records, traffic patterns, witness statements, and travel times between locations. These analyses helped investigators understand how quickly the offender could move from one jurisdiction to another and which transportation routes might have been used. The public response evolved alongside the investigation. Schools throughout the affected region reviewed security procedures. Many modified outdoor activities or kept students indoors whenever practical. Parents, teachers, and school administrators worked together to reassure children while acknowledging the uncertainty surrounding the case. Businesses also adjusted their operations. Some employers reminded staff to remain attentive in large parking areas and encouraged employees to travel together whenever possible. Retail centers reviewed emergency procedures, and many residents reported changing everyday routines until more information became available. Throughout the region, people demonstrated both caution and resilience. Essential services continued to operate. Hospitals remained open, public transportation continued running, and businesses served customers despite understandable concern. Community organizations, faith groups, and local leaders encouraged residents to rely on verified information rather than speculation. Managing public communication became another significant challenge. Investigators needed assistance from the public and therefore encouraged people to report potentially relevant information. At the same time, officials had to balance transparency with the need to protect sensitive investigative details. Information released too early could compromise the investigation or lead to additional confusion. Thousands of tips were received. Most proved unrelated, but each required evaluation. Investigators documented vehicle sightings, interviewed witnesses, examined surveillance opportunities, and followed leads from across the region and beyond. The volume of information demanded extensive coordination among analysts, detectives, and patrol officers. As evidence accumulated, behavioral specialists also contributed to the investigation by examining the offender's apparent methods and decision-making. While behavioral analysis cannot identify a suspect by itself, it can assist investigators in understanding patterns, evaluating possible motives, and prioritizing investigative strategies. These assessments were considered alongside physical evidence rather than as substitutes for it. The investigation increasingly demonstrated the importance of interagency cooperation. Detectives, forensic scientists, prosecutors, crime analysts, and emergency communications personnel worked across traditional jurisdictional boundaries, sharing evidence and coordinating investigative decisions. The case highlighted both the strengths and the practical challenges of large-scale, multi-agency investigations. Although investigators had not yet identified those responsible, each day brought additional evidence. Ballistic comparisons, witness interviews, document analysis, and other investigative techniques gradually narrowed the range of possibilities. small pieces of information that appeared insignificant individually began to form a more coherent picture when viewed together. The case would ultimately become a significant study in modern law enforcement cooperation. Training programs continue to examine how agencies coordinated forensic evidence, shared intelligence, managed public communication, and organized investigative resources during a rapidly evolving series of crimes. For the communities affected, however, the investigation represented far more than an operational challenge. It was an effort to restore a sense of safety after weeks of uncertainty. Every lead pursued, every piece of evidence examined, and every collaborative meeting among investigators served the same purpose: identifying those responsible, preventing further loss of life, and providing answers to families whose lives had been permanently changed. The breakthrough would not come from a single dramatic discovery. Instead, it would emerge through the careful accumulation of forensic evidence, investigative persistence, and cooperation among agencies working toward the same goal. By the middle of October 2002, investigators had devoted enormous resources to the sniper investigation. Hundreds of law enforcement personnel from local, state, and federal agencies were working around the clock, reviewing evidence, interviewing witnesses, and evaluating thousands of tips from the public. Despite these efforts, identifying those responsible remained extraordinarily difficult. The attacks had occurred across multiple jurisdictions, often in locations connected by major highways. The offender or offenders left very little physical evidence at the scenes, and eyewitness accounts frequently conflicted with one another. Investigators therefore relied increasingly on forensic science and careful analysis rather than any single witness statement. One important development involved communications attributed to the offender. Authorities received written messages demanding money and suggesting that additional attacks would occur if specific demands were not met. These communications transformed the investigation. Detectives now had additional evidence to examine, including the language used, the physical documents themselves, and the methods through which the messages had been delivered. Forensic specialists analyzed every available aspect of the communications. Handwriting, fingerprints, DNA, paper, printing methods, and other physical characteristics were examined whenever possible. Investigators also carefully considered which information should remain confidential so that future communications could be authenticated if necessary. At the same time, analysts continued comparing evidence from every confirmed shooting. Ballistics remained central to the investigation. The ability to associate multiple crime scenes with the same firearm provided investigators with confidence that they were pursuing a single coordinated series of attacks. Geographic analysis also became increasingly valuable. By mapping the locations and examining travel routes, investigators developed a better understanding of how the offender or offenders appeared to move through the region. Although no single pattern immediately revealed a suspect, the accumulated evidence steadily narrowed the investigative focus. A significant turning point occurred when investigators revisited information connected to an earlier homicide in Alabama. A telephone communication directed law enforcement toward that case, prompting detectives to compare evidence across state lines. This comparison illustrated the importance of preserving records and maintaining cooperation between jurisdictions, even when incidents initially appear unrelated. Evidence associated with the Alabama investigation, including forensic information and records connected to a particular vehicle, provided new investigative leads. Those leads were carefully evaluated alongside information already gathered during the sniper investigation. Rather than relying on assumptions, investigators sought independent confirmation through multiple sources. Vehicle information, forensic evidence, and investigative records were compared to determine whether they supported one another. As these pieces began to align, detectives developed a more focused picture of what they were seeking. Attention increasingly centered on a blue 1990 Chevrolet Caprice. Earlier in the investigation, many reports had focused on white vans or box trucks. The new evidence suggested that those initial observations had not identified the vehicle actually associated with the crimes. This represented a major shift. Investigators distributed updated information to law enforcement agencies throughout the region. Officers were briefed on the revised vehicle description and instructed to remain alert while continuing routine patrol operations. The importance of interagency communication became especially clear during this period. Information developed by one investigative team had to reach officers across multiple states quickly and accurately. Dispatch centers, intelligence analysts, and command personnel worked continuously to ensure that relevant updates were shared without unnecessary delay. Meanwhile, forensic specialists continued examining evidence recovered from both crime scenes and investigative leads. Every confirmed finding strengthened the overall case. Rather than depending upon a single decisive discovery, the investigation advanced through the careful accumulation of independently verified evidence. The public remained an essential part of this process. Investigators continued encouraging citizens to report information while emphasizing the importance of accurate observations. Although many tips ultimately proved unrelated, the willingness of residents to cooperate demonstrated the critical role communities can play during major investigations. By late October, the investigation had entered a new phase. Authorities had not yet made an arrest, but they now possessed stronger forensic connections, more focused investigative leads, and increasing confidence regarding the vehicle associated with the crimes. Years of training, disciplined evidence collection, and cooperation among numerous agencies were beginning to produce results. The breakthrough had not arrived suddenly. It had emerged through persistence, careful forensic work, and the gradual assembly of many small pieces of information into a coherent investigative picture. The final step would be locating the vehicle and safely apprehending the individuals believed to be responsible, bringing an end to weeks of uncertainty for communities across Washington, Maryland, and Virginia. In the early hours of October 24, 2002, the weeks-long investigation reached its conclusion through careful coordination rather than chance alone. By that point, investigators had assembled multiple pieces of evidence from forensic analysis, witness interviews, and information connected to earlier crimes. Those separate findings had gradually narrowed the search and focused attention on a specific vehicle believed to be associated with the attacks. Law enforcement agencies throughout the region had been alerted to watch for a blue 1990 Chevrolet Caprice. Officers across several states received updated information through coordinated communication systems, reflecting the extensive cooperation that had developed during the investigation. Shortly after midnight, two witnesses at a highway rest area along Interstate 70 in Maryland observed a vehicle matching the description that had been distributed to law enforcement. They notified authorities, providing investigators with an opportunity to act on weeks of analytical and investigative work. Officers responded carefully. Because investigators believed the individuals associated with the vehicle were armed and had demonstrated the ability to carry out attacks from concealed positions, planning emphasized public safety and the protection of responding personnel. Law enforcement established a coordinated operation designed to minimize risk while preventing the suspects from leaving the area. When officers approached the parked vehicle, the two occupants were asleep inside. They were taken into custody without an exchange of gunfire. For investigators, the arrests marked the end of an intensive operation involving local police departments, state agencies, and numerous federal partners. For residents throughout Washington, Maryland, and Virginia, the announcement brought a measure of relief after weeks of uncertainty. Following the arrests, investigators obtained and documented evidence recovered from the vehicle in accordance with established forensic procedures. Among the items recovered was a Bushmaster XM-15 rifle chambered for .223 caliber ammunition. Additional evidence included equipment associated with the firearm, maps, communication devices, and other materials that investigators evaluated alongside evidence collected from crime scenes. Every item required careful examination. Forensic specialists compared the recovered rifle with ballistic evidence from multiple shootings. Through microscopic comparison of markings on bullets and cartridge cases, examiners were able to associate the firearm with the series of attacks. This scientific analysis became an important component of the prosecution's case because it relied upon physical evidence rather than speculation. Investigators also documented the vehicle itself. One of the most significant discoveries involved modifications made to the Chevrolet Caprice. The interior had been altered in a manner that allowed a shooter to fire from within the vehicle through a concealed opening near the rear of the car. These modifications helped explain why witnesses had been unable to identify the source of the gunfire during many of the attacks. The design demonstrated planning, but it also illustrated an important investigative lesson: appearances can be misleading. A vehicle that attracted little public attention became central to one of the largest criminal investigations in recent American history. As forensic examinations continued, prosecutors assembled evidence from multiple jurisdictions. Because the crimes had occurred across state lines and involved numerous victims, legal proceedings required close coordination among prosecutors and investigators in different courts. John Allen Muhammad and Lee Boyd Malvo were each charged in connection with multiple offenses. During court proceedings, prosecutors presented forensic evidence, witness testimony, investigative records, and other documentation developed during the investigation. The judicial process allowed both prosecution and defense to present evidence under established legal procedures before independent courts. Muhammad was ultimately convicted of capital murder in Virginia. He later received additional life sentences in Maryland. After the completion of the appeals process, he was executed by lethal injection in 2009 in accordance with Virginia law at that time. Malvo's legal proceedings followed a different path because he was 17 years old during the attacks. He received multiple sentences of life imprisonment. In subsequent years, decisions of the United States Supreme Court concerning mandatory life without parole sentences for juvenile offenders required aspects of several juvenile cases nationwide, including portions of Malvo's sentencing, to be reconsidered. Although legal proceedings concerning sentencing continued over time, he has remained incarcerated. The conclusion of the criminal trials did not end the impact of the case. Families continued living with the loss of loved ones whose lives had ended unexpectedly during ordinary daily activities. Anniversaries, birthdays, and family gatherings became reminders of people who should have been present but were not. For survivors who were injured, recovery involved more than physical healing. Some faced lengthy rehabilitation. Others experienced lasting psychological effects associated with surviving traumatic events. Community members who had witnessed attacks or lived through weeks of uncertainty also reported emotional consequences long after the investigation had concluded. Researchers have since recognized that widespread public fear can persist well beyond the resolution of a criminal case. Restoring a sense of security often requires time, accurate communication, and continued support for those directly affected. From a law enforcement perspective, the investigation became an influential case study. It highlighted the importance of rapidly sharing information across jurisdictions. It demonstrated the value of forensic science, particularly firearm identification and ballistic comparison. It reinforced the need for coordinated command structures during investigations that extend beyond the boundaries of a single police department. Training programs have continued to examine the investigation as an example of large-scale interagency cooperation. Analysts have also studied the management of public information, emphasizing the balance between encouraging useful tips and avoiding the spread of inaccurate rumors. The case likewise contributed to broader discussions regarding behavioral analysis, emergency response planning, and support services for victims and communities affected by major acts of violence. For many residents of the Washington metropolitan area, however, the most enduring memories are not about investigative techniques or courtroom proceedings. They remember changing everyday routines. They remember watching the news each evening, hoping no additional attacks had occurred. They remember accompanying children to school with heightened concern or completing simple errands with unusual caution. Those experiences illustrate how violence directed at random members of the public can affect entire communities, even among people who never directly encountered the offender. Today, the Beltway sniper case remains one of the most extensively studied criminal investigations in modern American history. It is examined not because of the notoriety of those responsible, but because of the lessons it provided for public safety, forensic science, interagency cooperation, and victim support. Its legacy is measured not by the attention given to the offenders, but by the continued efforts of investigators, prosecutors, emergency responders, mental health professionals, and community leaders to reduce the likelihood that similar events will occur again. Remembering this case responsibly means remembering the individuals whose ordinary lives were interrupted without warning, acknowledging the dedication of those who work to identify those responsible through lawful investigation, and recognizing the resilience shown by families and communities as they rebuilt their sense of safety after one of the most unsettling periods in the region's history. Although the arrests on October 24, 2002, brought an end to the series of attacks, the investigation continued for many months. Detectives, forensic specialists, prosecutors, and analysts remained responsible for documenting evidence, preparing court proceedings, and reviewing every confirmed incident to establish a complete and accurate record. The scale of the investigation made it one of the most significant law enforcement operations in the United States in the early 21st century. More than 20 agencies had contributed personnel, expertise, and resources. Local police departments worked alongside state investigators and federal agencies, demonstrating both the challenges and the advantages of coordinated investigations that crossed multiple jurisdictions. One of the principal lessons involved information sharing. Historically, criminal investigations often remained largely within the jurisdiction where a crime occurred. The Beltway sniper investigation highlighted the need for rapid communication among agencies when offenders moved freely across county and state boundaries. Information that might appear minor in one jurisdiction could become highly significant when combined with evidence collected elsewhere. Following the case, many agencies reviewed procedures governing intelligence sharing, evidence coordination, and joint investigative operations. Existing systems were strengthened to allow investigators to exchange information more efficiently during large-scale incidents. Forensic science also received renewed attention. Ballistics examination played an essential role in establishing that multiple shootings were linked to the same firearm. The investigation reinforced the importance of standardized evidence collection, careful preservation of physical evidence, and timely laboratory analysis. Advances in digital information management over subsequent years further improved investigators' ability to compare evidence across jurisdictions and identify connections that might otherwise remain unnoticed. Emergency communications represented another important area of study. During the investigation, emergency dispatch centers processed an extraordinary number of calls from concerned residents. While many reports ultimately proved unrelated to the case, each required evaluation because investigators could not initially determine which information would prove valuable. The experience demonstrated the importance of scalable communication systems capable of handling large volumes of public information during major investigations. Many agencies subsequently expanded procedures for managing tip lines, organizing incoming reports, and assigning analysts to evaluate information efficiently. The investigation also influenced approaches to public communication. Officials sought to provide timely information while avoiding the release of details that might compromise investigative efforts. This balance remains an important consideration in modern criminal investigations. Clear, accurate communication can encourage public cooperation while reducing confusion and limiting the spread of misinformation. Mental health professionals have also examined the broader effects of the case. Unlike many crimes that primarily affect those directly involved, random acts of public violence can produce widespread psychological consequences. Individuals who never encountered the offenders nevertheless reported increased anxiety, heightened vigilance, and changes in daily routines that persisted long after the investigation concluded. Researchers have described this phenomenon as a community-wide response to prolonged uncertainty. When people cannot predict where danger may occur, routine activities may begin to feel unfamiliar or unsafe. Recognizing these effects has contributed to greater emphasis on community support services following major public safety incidents. Schools throughout the affected region likewise reviewed emergency preparedness. Administrators evaluated procedures for outdoor activities, emergency notifications, and communication with families. Although no single policy can eliminate every risk, the experience encouraged ongoing discussions regarding preparedness and coordinated response planning. The case also remains an important subject in professional education. Police academies, forensic training programs, emergency management courses, and criminal justice curricula frequently examine aspects of the investigation. Students analyze decision-making processes, evidence management, interagency cooperation, and the legal considerations involved in complex, multi-jurisdictional cases. These educational discussions are not intended to emphasize those responsible for the crimes. Rather, they seek to understand how institutions responded, what challenges emerged, and which practices proved most effective. The ultimate value of studying the case lies in improving future investigations and strengthening public safety. For the families affected, however, these institutional lessons exist alongside deeply personal memories. No improvement in investigative procedure can restore the lives that were lost. The legal process established accountability, but it could not erase grief or replace the presence of loved ones. Remembering the case today therefore involves two equally important responsibilities. The first is to honor the victims by recognizing them as individuals whose lives extended far beyond the events of October 2002. The second is to apply the lessons learned so that investigators, emergency responders, policymakers, and communities are better prepared to respond effectively should similarly complex incidents ever arise again. Those enduring lessons, not the notoriety of the offenders, represent the case's most meaningful legacy. More than 2 decades have passed since the events of October 2002, yet the Beltway sniper case continues to be remembered for the profound effect it had on individuals, communities, and public institutions. While the investigation is frequently studied for its complexity and the extensive cooperation it required, the lasting significance of the case begins with the people whose lives were forever changed. The victims came from different backgrounds, professions, and communities. They had no connection to one another before the attacks. Their lives intersected only because they happened to be in public places during a series of crimes that appeared to select victims without any personal relationship or identifiable pattern. For their families, the passage of time has not erased loss. Parents lost children. Children lost parents. Spouses lost lifelong partners. Friends and colleagues lost people whose presence had shaped everyday life in ways that often become fully appreciated only after they are gone. Acts of remembrance have taken many forms. Family members, community organizations, and local institutions have participated in memorial events, educational programs, and other efforts intended to honor those who were killed and to recognize the resilience shown by survivors. These occasions provide opportunities not only to remember individual lives but also to reaffirm the importance of supporting those affected by violence. The case also contributed to broader conversations about trauma. Researchers have documented that traumatic events can affect entire communities, not only those directly injured. Residents throughout the Washington metropolitan area described changes in daily routines, increased vigilance, and a heightened awareness of personal safety during and after the investigation. For some individuals, those feelings gradually diminished. For others, reminders of the events continued to evoke strong emotional responses years later. Mental health professionals increasingly recognize that recovery from community-wide traumatic events requires more than resolving the criminal investigation. Access to counseling, community support, accurate information, and opportunities for remembrance all play important roles in helping individuals and neighborhoods recover. Within law enforcement, the case continues to serve as an important educational resource. Investigators study the coordination required among local, state, and federal agencies. Forensic specialists examine the role of ballistic evidence and systematic evidence collection. Emergency managers analyze communication strategies, resource allocation, and decision-making under rapidly changing circumstances. These lessons have informed later investigations involving multiple jurisdictions and have encouraged continued investment in information-sharing systems designed to improve cooperation among agencies. The legal system has also continued to evolve. The prosecution of Lee Boyd Malvo drew attention to broader legal questions concerning juvenile sentencing. Subsequent decisions of the United States Supreme Court regarding mandatory life without parole sentences for offenders who committed crimes as juveniles influenced the review of numerous cases nationwide. Those legal developments reflected constitutional questions extending well beyond this individual case and contributed to continuing discussions about juvenile justice in the United States. Public officials and educators frequently emphasize another lesson from the investigation: the importance of relying upon verified information during rapidly developing events. Throughout October 2002, investigators received thousands of reports from concerned citizens. Public cooperation proved valuable, but the experience also demonstrated how incomplete or inaccurate information can complicate an investigation. Since then, many agencies have refined their approaches to public communication, seeking to provide timely, accurate updates while protecting sensitive investigative information. Today, the Beltway sniper case occupies an important place in the history of American criminal investigations. It is remembered because it challenged investigators, tested systems of interagency cooperation, and highlighted the value of forensic science. It is also remembered because it revealed how random acts of violence can influence the daily lives of entire communities. Yet the most meaningful way to remember the case is not through the notoriety of those responsible. It is through the lives of the victims, the determination of investigators who work to establish the facts through lawful means, the professionalism of emergency responders who served affected communities, and the resilience shown by families and residents as they gradually rebuilt their sense of normalcy. The legacy of October 2002 is therefore larger than a single criminal investigation. It is a reminder that public safety depends upon cooperation, careful investigation, scientific evidence, responsible communication, and sustained support for victims and survivors. It demonstrates that while violence can disrupt communities, communities can also respond with professionalism, compassion, and resilience. Those lessons continue to influence law enforcement, emergency management, and victim services today. More importantly, they encourage future generations to remember not only what happened, but why careful investigation, respect for the rule of law, and compassion for those affected remain essential whenever communities confront acts of violence. In that sense, the enduring legacy of the Beltway sniper case is found not in the crimes themselves, but in the continuing commitment to learn from them, to support those whose lives were altered, and to strengthen the institutions and relationships that help communities recover after tragedy. Behind every famous criminal case are people whose names deserve to be remembered for more than the circumstances of their deaths. They were individuals with families, careers, friendships, ambitions, and everyday routines that were interrupted without warning. Remembering them means recognizing that the true measure of this case is not the notoriety of the offenders, but the lives that were taken, the families forever altered, and the resilience of communities that endured weeks of uncertainty while refusing to let fear define them forever.